Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. In this video, I'm going to reveal how a woman in ancient Egypt managed to become pharaoh in a world where that was supposed to be impossible, how she stayed in power for over 2 decades, while surrounded by enemies who wanted her throne, and why her reign was so successful that it terrified her successors into trying to erase her from history completely. I'll show you the brilliant strategies she used, the massive building projects that still amaze us today, and the shocking truth about what really happened to her. But first, let me give you some context that will blow your mind. Ancient Egypt had over 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. During that entire time, only a handful of women ever claimed the throne as pharaoh in their own right. Most lasted mere months or a few years at best. Hatshepsut ruled for 22 years and turned Egypt into the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth. That's not luck. That's pure strategic brilliance. Now, before we dive into how she pulled off the impossible, you need to understand just how radical what she did really was. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a political leader. The pharaoh was considered a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, destined to become Osiris after death. The role was so sacred, so fundamentally masculine in Egyptian thinking, that there wasn't even a feminine word for pharaoh in their language. When Hatshepsut took the throne, she literally had to invent new ways to describe herself. Here's where her story gets fascinating. Hatshepsut didn't start out planning to become pharaoh. She began as the wife of Thutmose II, which made her queen of Egypt. When her husband died young, his heir was Thutmose III, but there was one massive problem. The new pharaoh was just a child, probably around 7 years old. Egypt needed someone to run the kingdom until he came of age. Enter Hatshepsut. As the dead king's principal wife and the young pharaoh's stepmother, she was the obvious choice to serve as regent. This was actually pretty normal in Egyptian politics. Queen mothers and stepmothers had served as regents before. They would handle the day-to-day running of the kingdom, while the young pharaoh learned how to rule. Then, when he was old enough, usually around 16 or 18, they would step aside and let him take full control. But Hatshepsut had other plans. Somewhere during those first few years as regent, she made a decision that would change Egyptian history forever. She decided she wasn't going to step aside. Instead, she was going to become pharaoh herself. Now, here's what makes this absolutely incredible. She couldn't just declare herself pharaoh and expect everyone to go along with it. Ancient Egypt was a deeply religious society where everything had to be justified by divine will and ancient tradition. If she wanted to claim the throne, she needed to convince the priests, the nobles, the army, and the people that the gods themselves wanted her to be pharaoh. So how did she do it? This is where Hatshepsut's political genius really shines. She didn't try to overthrow the existing system. Instead, she worked within it, bending ancient traditions just enough to support her claim without breaking them completely. First, she emphasized her royal bloodline. Hatshepsut wasn't just any queen. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. In her propaganda, she started claiming that her father had chosen her as his heir, even though he had sons. She commissioned artwork showing Thutmose I presenting her to the court as his successor. Was this true? We'll probably never know for sure, but it was brilliant politics. Next, she tackled the religious problem. If the gods wanted her to be pharaoh, there had to be divine proof. So Hatshepsut created one of the most audacious religious claims in Egyptian history. She announced that she was the daughter of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods himself. According to her story, Amun-Ra had appeared to her mother and conceived Hatshepsut to be pharaoh. This wasn't completely unprecedented. Many pharaohs claimed divine parentage, but Hatshepsut took it further. She commissioned a series of reliefs at her temple in Deir el-Bahari, showing her divine birth story in incredible detail. The artwork shows Amun-Ra choosing her mother, the conception, the birth, and the gods declaring that Hatshepsut would be pharaoh. It was like an ancient Egyptian comic book proving her right to rule. But here's the most fascinating part of her strategy. Hatshepsut realized that to be accepted as pharaoh, she needed to look the part. And in ancient Egypt, pharaohs were always depicted in very specific ways. They wore the false beard of kingship, the double crown, and held the crook and flail. These weren't just accessories. They were sacred symbols that transformed the wearer into a living god. So Hatshepsut did something that still shocks people today. She started appearing in full pharaonic regalia, complete with the false beard. Early in her reign, some artwork shows her with feminine features, but wearing masculine royal symbols. Later images show her with a completely masculine appearance. She even changed her name, adding masculine endings to make it sound more kingly. Some people today see this as Hatshepsut denying her femininity or trying to become a man. But that completely misses the point. Hatshepsut wasn't trying to become a man. She was trying to become pharaoh, and pharaoh was a role that transcended normal human gender. By adopting masculine royal imagery, she was claiming that the gods had transformed her into something beyond ordinary womanhood. She was claiming to be divine. And incredibly, it worked. The priests accepted her. The nobles supported her. The army followed her commands. Even young Thutmose III, who had every reason to hate her for taking his throne, seems to have gone along with the arrangement, at least publicly. But gaining the throne was just the beginning. Now Hatshepsut had to prove she deserved it. And this is where her reign becomes truly remarkable, because she didn't just maintain Egypt's power, she expanded it in ways that made her predecessors look like amateurs. Let's talk about what Egypt looked like when Hatshepsut took control. The kingdom was already wealthy and powerful, but it was facing some serious challenges. The previous pharaohs had focused heavily on military expansion, conquering territories in Nubia and the Levant. This brought in wealth through tribute and trade, but it also created constant military expenses and the risk of rebellion. Hatshepsut looked at this situation and made a decision that proved her strategic genius. Instead of continuing the endless cycle of conquest and rebellion, she would focus on making Egypt so wealthy and powerful through trade that other nations would want to be her allies rather than her enemies. The centerpiece of this strategy was one of the most ambitious expeditions in ancient history. Hatshepsut organized a massive trading expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, somewhere along the Red Sea coast, probably in modern-day Somalia or Ethiopia. This wasn't just a few ships carrying trinkets. This was a full-scale commercial and diplomatic mission designed to establish Egypt as the dominant trading power in the region. The expedition to Punt became legendary, and Hatshepsut made sure everyone knew about it. She covered the walls of her temple with detailed scenes showing Egyptian ships loaded with exotic goods, meeting with the rulers of Punt and bringing back incredible wealth. The artwork shows myrrh trees being carefully transported in pots, live animals including giraffes and leopards, gold, ivory, and precious incense. But here's what makes this expedition brilliant. Hatshepsut wasn't just collecting exotic goods for the royal treasury. She was establishing trade relationships that would make Egypt wealthy for generations. The myrrh trees weren't just valuable in themselves. They were planted in Egypt, creating a domestic source of one of the most precious substances in the ancient world. The success of the Punt expedition sent a message to every other kingdom in the region. Egypt under Hatshepsut was wealthy, organized, and powerful enough to mount massive expeditions to distant lands. Other rulers started sending ambassadors with tribute and gifts, hoping to establish their own trading relationships. And this brings us to perhaps the most impressive aspect of Hatshepsut's reign. While her male predecessors and successors are remembered primarily for their military campaigns, Hatshepsut created wealth and stability through commerce and diplomacy. Egypt during her reign became richer than it had ever been before, and she used that wealth to fund building projects that still take your breath away today. We're talking about construction on a scale that rivals anything built in human history. Hatshepsut didn't just restore existing temples, she rebuilt them completely, making them larger and more magnificent than ever before. She erected massive obelisks, some of which still stand today, weighing hundreds of tons and carved from single pieces of granite quarried hundreds of miles away. But the crown jewel of her building program was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement. The temple rises in 3 terraces connected by ramps, perfectly integrated into the natural rock formation. Even today, 4,500 years later, architects and engineers study this building to understand how it was designed and constructed. The temple at Deir el-Bahari wasn't just impressive because of its size or beauty. It was revolutionary because of what it represented. Every previous pharaoh had built their mortuary temple as a separate structure near their tomb. Hatshepsut integrated hers directly into the sacred landscape of the Valley of the Kings, making it part of the mountain itself. The message was clear. She wasn't just another ruler who happened to be buried here. She belonged to this place, and this place belonged to her. But here's where Hatshepsut's political genius really shows. She knew that building impressive monuments wasn't enough. She needed to make sure future generations would remember her as a legitimate pharaoh, not just as a woman who temporarily seized power. So she did something that was both brilliant and dangerous. She started rewriting history. Throughout Egypt, Hatshepsut ordered the creation of new inscriptions and reliefs that presented her reign as part of the natural order of succession. She didn't erase previous pharaohs or claim their accomplishments. Instead, she positioned herself as the rightful continuation of her father's dynasty. The artwork from her reign shows her receiving the crown directly from Thutmose I, with young Thutmose III standing respectfully beside her as a junior co-ruler. This was incredibly risky. If anyone challenged these historical claims, it could undermine her entire legitimacy. But Hatshepsut was betting that her success as pharaoh would be so obvious, so undeniable, that no one would dare question how she got there. And for over 20 years, that bet paid off. During her reign, Egypt experienced what historians now call a golden age. The kingdom's borders were secure, not because of constant warfare, but because potential enemies were too busy profiting from trade relationships to risk military conflict. The treasury was full, not just from tribute extracted by force, but from voluntary commercial partnerships that benefited everyone involved. Hatshepsut used this stability and wealth to transform Egyptian society in ways that went far beyond impressive buildings. She invested heavily in infrastructure projects that improved life for ordinary Egyptians. New roads made trade easier and faster. Expanded irrigation systems brought more land under cultivation, increasing food production and supporting population growth. She also revolutionized Egyptian religion, but not in the way you might expect. Rather than imposing new gods or dramatically changing existing practices, Hatshepsut became the greatest patron of traditional Egyptian religion in the kingdom's history. She restored temples that had been neglected, established new festivals, and increased offerings to the gods on a scale never seen before. This wasn't just piety, it was brilliant politics. By showing unprecedented devotion to the traditional gods, Hatshepsut reinforced her claim that the gods had chosen her to rule. Every restored temple, every new festival, every generous offering was evidence that the gods approved of her reign. How else could Egypt be so prosperous and peaceful? But perhaps the most impressive aspect of her religious policy was how she handled the priesthood. In ancient Egypt, priests weren't just religious figures. They were powerful political players who controlled vast temple estates and influenced public opinion. Previous pharaohs had often struggled with priestly opposition or had to make costly concessions to maintain religious support. Hatshepsut took a different approach. Instead of trying to control the priests, she made them her partners. She consulted with them on major decisions, incorporated their advice into her policies, and made sure they shared in Egypt's growing prosperity. The result was unprecedented religious unity and stability. This partnership with the priesthood gave Hatshepsut something no previous pharaoh had enjoyed to the same degree: religious legitimacy that went beyond traditional royal ideology. The priests didn't just accept her rule because she was pharaoh. They actively promoted her as someone the gods had specially chosen for greatness, and the evidence seemed to support their claims. Egypt, during Hatshepsut's reign, experienced a series of exceptionally good Nile floods, ensuring abundant harvests year after year. Trade expeditions returned with unprecedented wealth. No major plagues or natural disasters struck the kingdom. Even her enemies seemed to prosper from their relationships with Egypt. To the ancient Egyptian mind, this pattern of success was proof of divine favor. The gods were clearly blessing Hatshepsut's reign, which meant opposing her was not just politically dangerous, but religiously forbidden. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of her rule. How did Hatshepsut handle the obvious problem of succession? She couldn't have children as pharaoh, at least not in the traditional sense. Egyptian royal ideology required the pharaoh to father the next generation of rulers. But Hatshepsut was a woman, and her stepson Thutmose III was still alive, and theoretically the rightful heir. Her solution was typically clever. Rather than trying to eliminate Thutmose III, or find a way to have her own children claim the throne, Hatshepsut positioned herself as a transitional ruler, chosen by the gods to prepare Egypt for Thutmose III's eventual reign. She presented her rule not as a permanent change to Egyptian succession law, but as a special divine intervention during a critical period in Egyptian history. This approach allowed her to maintain power while avoiding the appearance of completely overturning traditional succession. She was not stealing the throne from its rightful owner, she was preparing it for him, and the longer her reign continued to be successful, the more this narrative made sense to her subjects. Meanwhile, Thutmose III was not sitting idle. As he grew to adulthood, Hatshepsut gradually gave him more responsibilities and more visible roles in government. He led military campaigns in her name, participated in religious ceremonies, and learned the complex skills of royal administration. To outside observers, it looked like a remarkably smooth preparation for eventual succession. But behind the scenes, tensions were building. As Thutmose III matured and gained experience, he naturally began to develop his own ideas about how Egypt should be ruled. And those ideas didn't always align with Hatshepsut's policies. The most significant difference was over military expansion. Hatshepsut's focus on trade and diplomacy had brought Egypt unprecedented wealth and stability, but it had also allowed some traditional Egyptian territories to assert more independence. Cities and regions that had paid tribute to previous pharaohs were now treating Egypt as an equal partner rather than an overlord. Thutmose III, trained in traditional military leadership, saw this as weakness. In his view, Egypt's enemies were taking advantage of Hatshepsut's peaceful policies to prepare for future challenges to Egyptian dominance. He believed that only strong military action could maintain Egypt's position as the dominant regional power. These weren't just abstract policy disagreements. They represented fundamentally different visions of what Egypt should be. Hatshepsut saw the kingdom as the center of a prosperous trading network, where wealth and influence came from being the partner everyone wanted to work with. Thutmose III saw Egypt as a military empire, where respect and tribute came from being the power everyone was afraid to challenge. For years, these tensions remained below the surface. Hatshepsut was too successful, too popular, and too firmly established for Thutmose III to challenge directly. But as her reign entered its third decade, subtle changes began to appear in official artwork and inscriptions. Images of Thutmose III started appearing more frequently and more prominently. His name began appearing alongside Hatshepsut's in royal documents, suggesting a more equal partnership than before. New military preparations began, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but clearly designed to rebuild Egypt's capacity for major campaigns. Hatshepsut, now an experienced politician in her 50s, must have recognized these signs. But rather than trying to suppress Thutmose, the third's growing influence, she made a decision that reveals both her political wisdom and her understanding of Egyptian royal ideology. She began preparing for her own transition out of power. This wasn't defeat. This was perhaps the most brilliant political maneuver of Hatshepsut's entire career. She understood something that many rulers throughout history have failed to grasp. The key to lasting power isn't just knowing how to seize it or even how to keep it. It's knowing when and how to let it go. But here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating, because Hatshepsut didn't just quietly step aside like previous regents had done. Instead, she orchestrated what might be the most sophisticated political transition in ancient history. She was going to make sure that when she did step down, her legacy would be so firmly established that no one could ever question her legitimacy or erase her achievements. The first phase of her transition strategy was brilliant in its subtlety. Hatshepsut began sharing more ceremonial duties with Thutmose III, but she made sure these were always presented as her graciously allowing him to participate in her divine authority, not as him reclaiming his rightful position. The message was clear. She was choosing to include him, which meant the power was still hers to give. At the same time, she accelerated her building programs to an almost frantic pace. New temples, expanded existing structures, more obelisks, additional inscriptions telling her story. This wasn't vanity, this was insurance. The more permanently her achievements were carved in stone, the harder it would be for future rulers to pretend she had never existed. But the most ingenious part of her strategy involved something that would seem completely counterintuitive to most rulers. Hatshepsut began actively promoting the idea that her reign had been divinely temporary. She commissioned new inscriptions describing how the gods had specifically chosen her to rule during a critical period in Egyptian history, and how they had now indicated that her sacred mission was complete. Think about how brilliant this was. By framing her eventual transition as fulfilling divine will rather than succumbing to political pressure, Hatshepsut maintained her religious authority even while preparing to give up temporal power. She wasn't being forced out. She was completing the sacred task the gods had assigned her. The historical records from this period are frustratingly incomplete, but we can piece together some incredible details about what was happening behind the scenes. Hatshepsut spent enormous resources on gifts and donations to temples throughout Egypt. She established new religious festivals that would ensure her name was spoken in prayers for generations. She even created special priesthoods dedicated to maintaining her memory and her cult after death. This was political genius operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Every gift to a temple created priests who had personal reasons to remember her favorably. Every new festival embedded her name deeper into Egyptian religious tradition. Every special priesthood gave her allies institutional power that would survive her reign. Meanwhile, Thutmose III was making his own preparations. Historical records show that he began assembling military commanders who were loyal to him personally rather than to Hatshepsut. He started planning military campaigns that would restore Egypt's more aggressive imperial policies. He was essentially building a parallel government that could take control smoothly when the transition occurred. What makes this period so remarkable is that both rulers seem to have been preparing for the same transition, but for completely different reasons, and with totally different expectations about what would happen afterward. Hatshepsut was preparing to step down as a successful pharaoh whose achievements would be celebrated forever. Thutmose III was preparing to reclaim a throne that he believed had always rightfully been his. The tension between these two visions created one of the most fascinating power struggles in ancient history, and it was playing out entirely in public view. Every royal ceremony, every religious festival, every public appearance was simultaneously a demonstration of Hatshepsut's continuing authority and a rehearsal for Thutmose III's eventual succession. Foreign ambassadors watching these events must have been completely baffled. Egyptian royal protocol had never dealt with anything like this situation. How do you pay proper respect to a female pharaoh who is preparing to transition power to a male heir who has technically been the rightful ruler for over 20 years? The diplomatic challenges alone were staggering, but here's what makes Hatshepsut's handling of this situation absolutely masterful. She managed to maintain complete royal dignity and authority, even while obviously preparing to give up power. Every public appearance reinforced her status as a legitimate pharaoh, while simultaneously demonstrating her wisdom and divine guidance in preparing for succession. The clearest evidence of her political skill during this period comes from the artwork and inscriptions created in the final years of her reign. Rather than showing any signs of weakness or uncertainty, these images depict Hatshepsut at the height of her power and glory. She's shown receiving tribute from foreign nations, making offerings to the gods, and overseeing massive construction projects. But subtle changes in the imagery reveal what was really happening. Thutmose III appears more frequently and in more prominent positions. Sometimes he's shown performing royal duties independently, rather than just assisting Hatshepsut. The artistic evolution perfectly captures a gradual but deliberate transfer of authority. This brings us to one of the most mysterious aspects of Hatshepsut's story. Sometime around the 20th or 21st year of her reign, the historical record becomes much less clear. We know that Thutmose III began ruling as sole pharaoh, but the exact circumstances of Hatshepsut's departure from power remain frustratingly vague. Some historians believe she died naturally, possibly from illness or old age. Others suggest she may have been forced to abdicate due to increasing pressure from military factions loyal to Thutmose III. A few even propose that she voluntarily stepped down once she was satisfied that Egypt's transition would be smooth and her legacy secure. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened, but we can analyze what came next, and that tells us everything we need to know about how successful Hatshepsut's political strategies really were. When Thutmose III became sole ruler, he immediately began implementing the more aggressive military policies he had been planning. Within a few years, he launched a series of campaigns that restored Egyptian dominance over territories that had gained independence during Hatshepsut's peaceful reign. These campaigns were enormously successful, and Thutmose III became known as one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs. But here's the fascinating part. For the first 15 or 20 years of his solo reign, Thutmose III made no attempt to erase Hatshepsut from the historical record. Her inscriptions remained intact, her temples continued to function, and her religious festivals continued to be celebrated. This wasn't just tolerance, it was recognition that her reign had been legitimate and successful. Think about what this means. If Hatshepsut had been a usurper who had illegally seized power, Thutmose III would have immediately begun destroying evidence of her reign. The fact that he didn't suggest that even he acknowledged her right to have ruled. Her political strategy of positioning herself as a divinely chosen transitional ruler had worked perfectly. This period of coexistence between Hatshepsut's legacy and Thutmose III's new policies reveals something crucial about ancient Egyptian political culture. Success mattered more than strict adherence to traditional gender roles. As long as a ruler was effective and brought prosperity to Egypt, the population and elite would support them regardless of whether they fit conventional expectations. But this delicate balance couldn't last forever. As Thutmose III's own reign progressed and his military successes mounted, pressure began building to establish a clearer historical narrative that would emphasize traditional pharaonic masculinity and military achievement. The problem was that Hatshepsut's 22-year reign couldn't simply be ignored or forgotten. Too many people remembered it, too many monuments celebrated it, and too many religious institutions depended on traditions she had established. Any attempt to erase her completely would have been obvious and potentially destabilizing. So instead, a more subtle campaign began. Rather than destroying Hatshepsut's monuments, workers began carefully chiseling away her images and names, replacing them with those of Thutmose III or her husband Thutmose II. Rather than dismantling her religious festivals, they were gradually modified to honor different pharaohs. This process took decades and was never completely successful. The workers tasked with erasing Hatshepsut's legacy often did incomplete jobs, possibly because they personally remembered her reign fondly, or possibly because completely destroying such beautiful artwork felt wrong, even to them. The result is that today, we can still see evidence of this ancient cover-up. Walls that once showed Hatshepsut making offerings to the gods now show blank spaces where her figure was chiseled away. Inscriptions that once proclaimed her achievements now have different names, awkwardly inserted over obvious erasure marks. But ironically, this attempted erasure has actually helped preserve Hatshepsut's story for modern archaeologists. The incomplete nature of the destruction makes it obvious that something was deliberately hidden, which draws attention to what was removed. In many cases, enough traces remain that scholars can reconstruct the original images and inscriptions. More importantly, the physical evidence of Hatshepsut's achievements was too massive to destroy completely. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari still stands as one of the most impressive architectural accomplishments in Egyptian history. The obelisks she erected still tower over Karnak Temple. The trade relationships she established continue to bring wealth to Egypt for centuries. This brings us to perhaps the most important lesson from Hatshepsut's incredible story. Political power is ultimately about results, not just traditional authority. Hatshepsut succeeded as pharaoh not because she found some loophole in Egyptian law that allowed women to rule, but because she was extraordinarily good at the actual job of ruling. She understood that successful leadership requires adapting to circumstances rather than rigidly following precedent. When Egypt needed military expansion, previous pharaohs had provided military expansion. When Egypt needed stability and prosperity, Hatshepsut provided stability and prosperity. Her willingness to break with tradition wasn't rebellion against Egyptian culture. It was responsiveness to Egyptian needs. This is why her reign was so successful, and why attempts to erase her from history ultimately failed. You can destroy monuments and change inscriptions, but you can't erase the memory of 22 years of peace and prosperity. You can't undo successful trade relationships or pretend that architectural marvels were never built. The people who lived through Hatshepsut's reign knew what they had experienced, and they passed those memories to their children and grandchildren. Even when official history tried to ignore her, popular memory preserved the truth about Egypt's most successful female ruler, and this popular memory eventually influenced official history as well. Later, Egyptian texts began mentioning Hatshepsut again, sometimes critically, but always acknowledging her existence and her achievements. By the time Greek historians like Herodotus began writing about Egypt, Hatshepsut's story had been partially restored to the historical record. The Greeks were particularly fascinated by her story because it challenged their own assumptions about gender and political power. Greek women had very limited political rights, so the idea of a female pharaoh who had successfully ruled one of the world's most powerful kingdoms for over 2 decades was almost incomprehensible to them. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Greek visitors to Egypt could see Hatshepsut's temples and obelisks. They could read inscriptions that clearly identified her as pharaoh. They could talk to Egyptian priests who still maintained traditions she had established. The reality of her achievements was impossible to ignore or explain away. This Greek fascination with Hatshepsut helped preserve her story through the Roman period and into the medieval era. While many other aspects of ancient Egyptian history were forgotten or distorted over the centuries, the basic facts about Egypt's female pharaoh survived in various forms. When modern archaeology began systematically studying ancient Egypt in the 19th century, Hatshepsut was one of the first pharaohs to be rediscovered and properly understood. The combination of surviving monuments, partially destroyed inscriptions, and ancient historical references made it relatively easy to reconstruct the basic outline of her reign. But the more archaeologists studied her story, the more remarkable it became. Each new discovery revealed additional evidence of her political sophistication, her architectural ambitions, and her economic success. What had initially seemed like an interesting historical anomaly gradually emerged as one of the most impressive examples of effective leadership in the ancient world. Today, Hatshepsut is recognized not just as an important female ruler, but as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs regardless of gender. Her reign is studied as a masterclass in political strategy, economic development, and architectural innovation. Her story has become an inspiration for women in leadership positions around the world. But perhaps most importantly, Hatshepsut's legacy demonstrates something crucial about human potential and political possibility. She proved that effective leadership transcends traditional categories and expectations. When circumstances require it, extraordinary people can step beyond conventional roles and achieve extraordinary things. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not just by those who follow established patterns, but by those who have the courage and skill to create new ones when the situation demands it. Hatshepsut didn't just rule Egypt. She expanded our understanding of what rulership could be, and that's a legacy that no amount of chiseling away at monuments could ever truly erase. The question that haunts historians today is this: what if Hatshepsut had been born male? Would she be remembered alongside Ramesses the Great and Akhenaten as one of Egypt's most legendary pharaohs? The uncomfortable truth is that gender bias has shaped how we view ancient rulers for millennia, and Hatshepsut's story forces us to confront that bias head-on. But here's what makes her achievements even more extraordinary. She didn't just succeed despite being female in a male-dominated world. She succeeded so completely that she redefined what pharaonic power could look like. Her reign wasn't just an exception to Egyptian royal tradition, it was an evolution of it. Let's dive deeper into how Hatshepsut's political genius actually worked on a day-to-day level, because this is where her story becomes absolutely fascinating. Most pharaohs ruled through a combination of divine authority, military power, and bureaucratic control. Hatshepsut had to add another layer: constant political theatre designed to reinforce her legitimacy. Every public appearance was choreographed to demonstrate that the gods supported her rule. Every royal ceremony included elements that emphasized her divine selection. Every administrative decision was presented not just as royal policy, but as the fulfillment of divine will. This wasn't propaganda in the modern sense. This was sophisticated political communication designed to maintain stability in an unprecedented situation. Consider what this meant for her daily routine. While male pharaohs could simply issue commands and expect obedience, Hatshepsut had to constantly demonstrate that her commands carried divine authority. She couldn't just wear the crown and false beard during major ceremonies. She had to embody the role of pharaoh so completely that everyone around her would forget they were dealing with something historically unusual. This required an incredible level of personal discipline and political awareness. One mistake, one moment of appearing uncertain or illegitimate, could have triggered a crisis that would end her reign and possibly destabilize the entire kingdom. The pressure must have been enormous, but historical records suggest she handled it with remarkable grace and skill. Her court officials seem to have genuinely respected her judgment and ability. Foreign ambassadors wrote dispatches describing her as a formidable negotiator and a shrewd political strategist. Even her potential enemies within Egypt appear to have grudgingly admired her effectiveness as a ruler. This brings us to one of the most impressive aspects of Hatshepsut's reign: her ability to manage competing factions within Egyptian society. Ancient Egypt wasn't a monolithic kingdom where the pharaoh's word was automatically accepted. It was a complex collection of regional interests, religious institutions, military commanders, and noble families, all with their own agendas and power bases. Previous pharaohs had typically managed these factions through a combination of rewards, threats, and military force. Hatshepsut developed a more sophisticated approach based on creating mutual benefit and shared prosperity. Instead of demanding loyalty through fear, she earned it through results. Take her relationship with the military, for example. Traditional Egyptian pharaohs were expected to be warrior kings who personally led armies into battle. Hatshepsut couldn't fulfill this role in the conventional sense, but she found ways to keep military leaders satisfied and loyal. She increased military budgets and improved soldiers' equipment and pay. She commissioned impressive military monuments and ceremonies that honored Egypt's martial traditions. Most importantly, she used Egypt's growing wealth to fund military infrastructure projects that enhanced the kingdom's defensive capabilities without requiring expensive foreign campaigns. The result was a military that remained loyal and effective, even though it wasn't being used for constant expansion. When occasional border conflicts did arise, Egyptian forces under Hatshepsut's command performed well, demonstrating that her peaceful policies hadn't weakened Egypt's ability to defend itself. Her approach to the nobility was equally clever. Rather than trying to suppress potential rivals or force them into submission, Hatshepsut created opportunities for advancement and enrichment that made supporting her regime more profitable than opposing it. She expanded the royal bureaucracy, creating new positions and responsibilities that gave ambitious nobles productive outlets for their energy. She also used her building projects as a form of economic stimulus that benefited noble families throughout Egypt. Major construction projects required enormous amounts of materials, labor, and logistical coordination. Noble families who controlled quarries, transportation networks, or skilled craftsmen found themselves prospering as never before. This created a network of economic interests that had powerful reasons to support Hatshepsut's continued rule. Even nobles who might have preferred a traditional male pharaoh had to acknowledge that challenging her would threaten their own prosperity and that of their dependents. But perhaps her most brilliant political achievement was how she handled Egypt's relationship with neighboring kingdoms. Traditional Egyptian foreign policy had been based on demonstrating superior military power and extracting tribute through the threat of conquest. This approach worked, but it required constant military campaigns and created persistent enemies who were always looking for opportunities to rebel or seek revenge. Hatshepsut pioneered what we might call economic diplomacy. Instead of demanding tribute, she offered trade partnerships. Instead of threatening conquest, she provided mutual benefit. Instead of creating vassal states, she built commercial networks. The expedition to Punt wasn't just about acquiring exotic goods. It was about demonstrating a new model of international relations based on cooperation rather than domination. The success of this expedition encouraged other kingdoms to seek similar arrangements with Egypt, transforming the country from a military empire into the center of a vast commercial network. This shift had profound implications for Egyptian society. Military campaigns had traditionally been the primary source of wealth for the kingdom, but they also drained resources and created risks. Trade relationships generated wealth more consistently and with far less risk, allowing Egypt to prosper without the constant threat of military disaster. Foreign rulers who had once feared Egyptian armies now competed to become Egypt's preferred trading partners. Diplomatic marriages, commercial agreements, and cultural exchanges replaced military campaigns as the primary tools of Egyptian foreign policy. The result was unprecedented stability and prosperity throughout the region. But Hatshepsut's innovations went beyond politics and economics. She also transformed Egyptian architecture and art in ways that influenced the kingdom's culture for centuries. Her building projects weren't just impressive monuments. They were experiments in new forms of artistic expression that reflected her unique position in Egyptian history. Traditional pharaonic art had followed strict conventions designed to emphasize the ruler's divine nature and masculine authority. Hatshepsut's artists had to develop new visual languages that could convey the same messages while accommodating her unprecedented circumstances. The result was some of the most innovative and beautiful art in Egyptian history. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari wasn't just architecturally revolutionary. It was a masterpiece of artistic integration that combined sculpture, painting, and architecture into a unified statement about divine kingship and royal legitimacy. The scenes depicting her divine birth and coronation represent some of the most sophisticated narrative art ever created in ancient Egypt. These weren't just decorative images, they were complex theological and political arguments presented in visual form, designed to convince viewers that Hatshepsut's rule was not only legitimate, but divinely ordained. Her artists also developed new ways of depicting royal power that influenced Egyptian art for generations. The integration of natural landscape elements into architectural design, the use of terraced construction to create dramatic visual effects, and the sophisticated interplay between interior and exterior spaces all became standard features of later Egyptian architecture. Even the controversial images of Hatshepsut wearing masculine royal regalia represent artistic innovation rather than simple imitation of male pharaonic imagery. Her artists created visual representations that conveyed divine kingship while acknowledging the unique circumstances of her reign. These images weren't trying to make Hatshepsut look like a man. They were trying to show how divine kingship could transcend conventional gender categories. This artistic revolution reflected deeper changes in Egyptian religious and political thought. Hatshepsut's reign forced Egyptian intellectuals to reconsider fundamental assumptions about rulership, divine authority, and social organization. The theological justifications created for her reign expanded Egyptian understanding of how the gods could work through human agents. Her religious innovations were equally significant. While maintaining traditional Egyptian religious practices, Hatshepsut introduced new elements that emphasized the flexibility and responsiveness of divine will. Her reign demonstrated that the gods could choose unconventional agents when circumstances required it, expanding Egyptian theology in ways that influenced religious thought for centuries. The festivals and ceremonies she established often incorporated themes of divine adaptation and renewal, reflecting her own experience of transforming from queen to pharaoh in response to divine calling. These religious innovations helped normalize the idea that traditional roles and expectations could evolve when necessary to serve higher purposes. Her patronage of existing religious institutions was equally transformative. Rather than simply maintaining traditional practices, Hatshepsut invested in expanding and improving religious infrastructure throughout Egypt. She didn't just restore old temples, she rebuilt them on scales that surpassed anything previously seen. The economic impact of these religious investments was enormous. Temple construction projects provided employment for thousands of workers, from skilled artisans to common laborers. The expanded temple complexes required permanent staff to maintain and operate them, creating long-term economic opportunities in communities throughout Egypt. But more importantly, these religious investments demonstrated Hatshepsut's commitment to Egyptian cultural traditions, even while she was transforming Egyptian political traditions. By becoming the greatest patron of traditional religion in Egyptian history, she proved that innovation and tradition could coexist and mutually reinforce each other. This balance between innovation and tradition became one of the defining characteristics of her reign. She didn't reject Egyptian culture in order to claim power. Instead, she found ways to expand Egyptian culture to accommodate new possibilities, while preserving its essential character. Her approach to royal succession planning demonstrates this balance perfectly. Rather than trying to establish a new dynastic line or permanently alter Egyptian succession law, Hatshepsut positioned her reign as a temporary divine intervention that would ultimately restore traditional succession patterns. This allowed her to maintain power without threatening the fundamental stability of Egyptian political institutions. She wasn't trying to destroy the existing system. She was trying to help it navigate an unprecedented crisis in a way that would preserve its long-term viability. The gradual transition of authority to Thutmose III represented the successful completion of this mission. By the time he became sole pharaoh, Egypt was more prosperous, more stable, and more secure than it had been when Hatshepsut first became regent. Her temporary innovation had strengthened rather than weakened traditional Egyptian institutions. This is why Thutmose III initially preserved rather than destroyed evidence of her reign. He understood that her rule had been beneficial to Egypt, and that attempting to erase it completely would be both historically dishonest and politically dangerous. The later campaign to diminish her legacy came from different political pressures and represented a less sophisticated understanding of what she had accomplished. But here's what makes Hatshepsut's story absolutely crucial for understanding ancient Egypt and political leadership in general. She proved that effective governance transcends conventional categories and expectations. Her success wasn't achieved by rejecting femininity or pretending to be something she wasn't. It was achieved by demonstrating that leadership ability is more important than conformity to traditional roles. This lesson resonated throughout Egyptian history and influenced how later rulers approached the challenges of governance. Several subsequent pharaohs adopted elements of Hatshepsut's political and economic strategies, particularly her emphasis on trade relationships and monumental construction projects. Her architectural innovations became standard features of Egyptian royal building, and her diplomatic approaches influenced Egyptian foreign policy for centuries. Even her religious innovations continued to shape Egyptian theology long after her death. More broadly, Hatshepsut's reign demonstrated that political institutions can adapt and evolve without losing their essential character. Her temporary transformation of pharaonic rulership helped preserve, rather than destroy, Egyptian political stability during a critical period in the kingdom's history. This flexibility and adaptability became one of the sources of Egypt's remarkable longevity as a civilization. While other ancient kingdoms collapsed when faced with unprecedented challenges, Egypt developed the capacity to innovate and adapt while maintaining cultural continuity. Hatshepsut's story also reveals something important about the relationship between individual leadership and historical change. She didn't succeed simply because she was an exceptional person, although she certainly was that. She succeeded because she understood how to work within existing systems while gradually transforming them to meet new needs. Her political genius lay not in rejecting Egyptian traditions, but in finding ways to expand them. She didn't try to impose foreign models of governance on Egypt. Instead, she developed uniquely Egyptian solutions to uniquely Egyptian problems. This approach required an extraordinary combination of political skill, cultural sensitivity, and personal courage. She had to be bold enough to break with precedent, while being careful enough not to trigger destructive conflicts. She had to be innovative enough to solve new problems, while being traditional enough to maintain legitimacy. The fact that she sustained this delicate balance for over 2 decades while achieving remarkable success demonstrates a level of political sophistication that few rulers in any era have matched. Her reign represents one of the great achievements in the history of governance and leadership. But perhaps most importantly, Hatshepsut's story challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about historical possibility and human potential. Her success proves that extraordinary circumstances can create opportunities for extraordinary people to achieve extraordinary things, regardless of conventional limitations and expectations. Her legacy reminds us that history is shaped not just by those who follow established patterns, but by those who have the vision and skill to create new patterns when circumstances demand it. She didn't just rule Egypt effectively, she expanded our understanding of what effective rulership could look like. And that expansion of possibility, that demonstration that traditional limitations are not absolute limitations, may be her most important contribution to human history. She proved that when the situation requires it, exceptional people can transcend conventional categories and achieve the seemingly impossible. This is why attempts to erase her from history ultimately failed, and why her story continues to inspire people today. You can destroy monuments and change inscriptions, but you cannot erase the fundamental truth that she demonstrated. Human potential is not limited by traditional expectations, and exceptional circumstances can create opportunities for exceptional achievements. Hatshepsut didn't just become pharaoh. Despite being a woman in ancient Egypt, she became one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, precisely because she brought unique perspectives and approaches to the challenges of rulership. Her gender wasn't an obstacle she overcame. It was one of the sources of her distinctive strengths as a leader. This reframing of her story transforms our understanding not just of ancient Egypt, but of leadership itself. She shows us that diversity of experience and perspective can be a source of strength rather than weakness, and that the most effective solutions to complex problems often come from those who approach them from unexpected angles. Her 22-year reign stands as proof that when we expand our definitions of who can lead and how leadership can be exercised, we create opportunities for innovations and achievements that would otherwise be impossible. And that may be the most important lesson from the incredible story of Hatshepsut, the queen who became king, and in doing so, redefined what both queenship and kingship could mean. But what happened next reveals the true measure of Hatshepsut's political genius, and shows us why her story becomes even more extraordinary as we approach its conclusion. When modern archaeologists first began seriously studying Hatshepsut in the 20th century, they made discoveries that completely changed our understanding of her reign and its aftermath. The evidence they uncovered tells a story far more complex and fascinating than the simple narrative of a female pharaoh who was later erased from history. Let's start with what they found at her mortuary temple. When archaeologists began systematic excavations at Deir el-Bahari, they expected to find evidence of deliberate destruction and erasure. What they actually discovered was far more intriguing. Yes, many of Hatshepsut's images had been chiseled away, but the work was selective, careful, and in many cases incomplete. More importantly, they found evidence that the temple had continued to function as an active religious site for centuries after Hatshepsut's death. Priests had maintained her cult, pilgrims had continued to visit, and later pharaohs had actually added their own inscriptions and decorations to the complex. This wasn't the behavior you'd expect if Hatshepsut had been completely discredited or forgotten. The archaeological evidence suggests something much more nuanced than historical erasure. It appears that different pharaohs at different times had different attitudes toward Hatshepsut's legacy, and these attitudes were influenced by changing political circumstances rather than simple gender bias. For example, some of the defacement appears to have occurred during periods when Egypt was facing military threats and needed to emphasize traditional warrior kingship. During peaceful periods, Hatshepsut's monuments were often restored and maintained. This pattern suggests that her legacy was used as a political tool by later rulers rather than being systematically suppressed. But the most remarkable discovery was what archaeologists found when they looked beyond the obvious monuments. Scattered throughout Egypt, in smaller temples and local shrines, they found hundreds of inscriptions and images of Hatshepsut that had never been touched by later defacement campaigns. These discoveries revealed that her impact on Egyptian society had been far broader and deeper than anyone had previously understood. Local communities throughout Egypt had commissioned their own monuments honoring Hatshepsut during her reign. These weren't royal projects mandated by the central government. They were grassroots expressions of genuine popular support and admiration. The fact that these local monuments survived suggests that Hatshepsut's reputation among ordinary Egyptians remained positive long after her death. Even more fascinating, archaeologists began finding evidence that some of Hatshepsut's innovations had become permanent features of Egyptian culture. Administrative documents from centuries after her death show government officials using bureaucratic procedures she had established. Religious texts show prayers and ceremonies she had created still being performed. Economic records show trade relationships she had initiated still generating wealth for Egypt. This evidence reveals that while later pharaohs may have tried to diminish Hatshepsut's personal legacy, they couldn't undo the practical improvements she had made to Egyptian society. Her reign had created institutional changes that were too beneficial to abandon, even when her memory was being officially suppressed. The discovery of her actual mummy in 2007 provided even more insights into her story. Modern forensic analysis revealed that Hatshepsut had lived to be around 50 years old, which was quite advanced for ancient Egypt. She showed signs of diabetes and possibly bone cancer, but also evidence of having lived a physically active and well-nourished life consistent with royal status. More intriguingly, analysis of her mummy and burial goods suggested that she had been given full pharaonic burial honors, including mummification techniques reserved for legitimate rulers. If she had been considered a usurper, she would never have received this treatment. The fact that she was buried with all the dignity and ceremony appropriate to a pharaoh proves that her legitimacy was recognized even after her death. The location where her mummy was found also tells us something important. She wasn't buried in her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Instead, she was interred in a simple tomb in the Valley of the Kings, alongside other legitimate pharaohs. This suggests that even if later rulers wanted to diminish her public legacy, they still acknowledged her right to rest among Egypt's royal dead. But perhaps the most significant recent discovery has been the identification of inscriptions that appear to have been created during the final years of Hatshepsut's reign. These texts provide our clearest evidence of how she managed her transition out of power and what she expected her legacy to be. The inscriptions describe Hatshepsut as completing a sacred mission assigned to her by the gods. They present her reign not as a permanent change to Egyptian succession law, but as a temporary divine intervention that had successfully restored stability and prosperity to Egypt. Most importantly, they describe her voluntary transfer of power to Thutmose III as the final act of her divinely appointed role. This evidence supports the theory that Hatshepsut orchestrated her own transition rather than being forced from power. She had spent years preparing Egypt for Thutmose III's sole rule, and when the time came, she stepped aside gracefully, confident that her achievements would speak for themselves. The inscriptions also reveal something remarkable about her final political strategy. Rather than trying to ensure that her immediate successors would continue her policies, Hatshepsut focused on creating institutional changes that would survive regardless of who held power. She embedded her innovations so deeply into Egyptian government, religion, and culture that they became permanent features of the civilization. This long-term thinking demonstrates a level of political sophistication that sets Hatshepsut apart from most rulers throughout history. She understood that individual leaders are temporary, but institutional changes can be permanent. By focusing on transforming Egyptian systems, rather than just exercising personal power, she ensured that her impact would outlast any attempts to diminish her memory. Modern analysis of Egyptian economic records from the centuries following her reign confirms that this strategy worked. Egypt continued to benefit from the trade relationships she had established, the administrative procedures she had created, and the religious innovations she had introduced long after her personal legacy had been officially suppressed. Her architectural legacy was equally enduring. The building techniques pioneered at Deir el-Bahari influenced Egyptian construction for the rest of the pharaonic period. Later pharaohs repeatedly tried to copy the visual impact of her terraced temple design, though none ever matched its elegance and integration with the natural landscape. The artistic innovations developed during her reign also became standard features of Egyptian royal art. The sophisticated use of narrative scenes to convey complex political and religious messages, the integration of architectural and sculptural elements, and the development of new visual symbols for divine kingship all became permanent parts of Egyptian artistic tradition. But beyond these concrete legacies, Hatshepsut's reign had a more subtle but perhaps more important impact on Egyptian political culture. She had demonstrated that effective governance was more important than rigid adherence to traditional roles and expectations. This lesson influenced how later pharaohs approached the challenges of rulership. Subsequent Egyptian rulers showed greater flexibility in adapting to unusual circumstances, greater willingness to experiment with new policies, and greater sensitivity to the need to justify their innovations in terms of Egyptian traditions and values. While they may not have explicitly credited Hatshepsut for these approaches, the precedent she had established clearly influenced their thinking. Her reign also appears to have influenced Egyptian attitudes toward female political participation more generally. While no other woman achieved the throne as sole pharaoh for centuries after Hatshepsut, several queens during the later New Kingdom period exercised far more political influence than their predecessors had. Royal women became more involved in diplomatic negotiations, religious ceremonies, and even military planning. This gradual expansion of female political roles suggests that Hatshepsut's reign had shifted Egyptian thinking about gender and governance in lasting ways. She had proved that women could exercise supreme political authority effectively, and while this lesson may have been officially suppressed, it appears to have influenced actual political practice. The international impact of her reign was equally significant. Foreign kingdoms that had developed trade relationships with Egypt during Hatshepsut's rule continued to prefer diplomatic and commercial solutions to conflicts rather than military ones. The model of international relations she had pioneered became increasingly common throughout the ancient Near East. Later, Egyptian pharaohs found that they could often achieve their foreign policy objectives through the threat of cutting off profitable trade relationships rather than through military conquest. This approach was generally less expensive and more sustainable than traditional imperial expansion, and it became a standard tool of Egyptian diplomacy. Archaeological evidence from neighboring kingdoms shows Egyptian goods, artistic styles, and cultural practices spreading throughout the region during and after Hatshepsut's reign. This cultural influence was often more enduring than military conquest, creating lasting connections between Egypt and other civilizations. The Greek historians who later wrote about Egypt were particularly impressed by evidence of these cultural exchanges. They described Egypt during Hatshepsut's era as the center of an international network of cities and kingdoms that competed to imitate Egyptian achievements rather than to resist Egyptian power. This transformation from military empire to cultural hegemon represented one of Hatshepsut's most important contributions to ancient history. She had shown that a kingdom could maintain dominance through attraction rather than coercion, through offering benefits rather than threatening punishment. The Roman historians who inherited Greek accounts of Egyptian history were even more fascinated by this aspect of her reign. Rome itself had achieved dominance primarily through military conquest, but Roman intellectuals were increasingly interested in alternative models of imperial governance that might be more sustainable and less expensive to maintain. Some Roman political theorists explicitly cited Hatshepsut's reign as an example of how effective civilian leadership could achieve better results than military conquest. While Rome never fully adopted her approaches, her example influenced Roman thinking about provincial administration and diplomatic relations. The preservation of her story through these classical sources ensured that knowledge of her achievements survived, even when Egyptian civilization itself declined. Medieval scholars had access to Greek and Roman accounts of her reign, and these accounts helped maintain awareness of her historical importance. When European scholars began systematic study of ancient Egypt during the Renaissance, Hatshepsut was one of the first pharaohs they were able to identify and understand. The combination of classical historical accounts and surviving monuments made her story relatively easy to reconstruct compared to other ancient rulers. This early scholarly attention helped establish Hatshepsut as an important historical figure in European consciousness, centuries before modern archaeology fully revealed the extent of her achievements. By the time systematic excavation began in Egypt, she was already recognized as one of ancient history's most significant female rulers. The 19th and early 20th century archaeological discoveries that filled in the details of her story only confirmed what classical sources had suggested. She hadn't just been an interesting historical anomaly. She had been one of the most effective rulers in Egyptian history, whose innovations had influenced the development of civilization itself. Modern feminist historians have understandably embraced Hatshepsut as a symbol of female political capability, but her significance extends far beyond gender issues. Her reign demonstrates universal principles of effective leadership that apply regardless of the leader's identity or the specific challenges they face. She showed that successful governance requires adapting to circumstances rather than rigidly following precedent. She proved that innovation and tradition can reinforce each other when skillfully balanced. She demonstrated that long-term institutional change is more important than short-term personal power. Perhaps most importantly, she established that political legitimacy ultimately depends on results rather than conventional qualifications. Her reign succeeded because it made Egypt more prosperous, more stable, and more secure, not because she met traditional expectations for pharaonic rulership. These lessons remain relevant for political leaders today. In our rapidly changing world, the ability to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining institutional stability is more important than ever. Hatshepsut's example shows how this balance can be achieved through skillful political leadership. Her story also demonstrates the importance of thinking beyond immediate political survival toward long-term institutional health. Too many modern leaders focus exclusively on maintaining their personal power rather than on creating lasting improvements to the systems they govern. Hatshepsut understood that true political success means leaving institutions stronger than you found them, even if that means accepting constraints on your personal authority. Her willingness to prepare for her own transition out of power ensured that her innovations would survive and benefit future generations. The modern rediscovery of her story has also provided important insights into how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. The fact that such a significant ruler could be partially erased from history demonstrates how political considerations can distort our understanding of the past. But it also shows that truth has a way of surviving attempts at suppression. The physical evidence of Hatshepsut's achievements was too substantial to destroy completely, and the beneficial effects of her innovations were too obvious to ignore indefinitely. Her story reminds us to be skeptical of official historical narratives, and to look for evidence of voices and perspectives that may have been deliberately suppressed. How many other important historical figures have been diminished or forgotten because they didn't fit conventional expectations? The ongoing archaeological work in Egypt continues to reveal new evidence about Hatshepsut's reign and its impact. Recent discoveries suggest that her influence on Egyptian culture may have been even greater than previously understood, and that the attempt to erase her legacy was less successful than once believed. These discoveries are gradually reshaping our understanding of ancient Egyptian politics, gender relations, and cultural development. They're also providing new insights into the mechanisms by which historical memory is preserved, distorted, and recovered. But perhaps the most important lesson from Hatshepsut's story is about the relationship between individual agency and historical change. She succeeded not because she was somehow exempt from the constraints that limited other women in ancient Egypt, but because she found ways to work within and gradually transform those constraints. Her example shows that even apparently rigid social and political systems contain possibilities for change when approached with sufficient skill, patience, and strategic thinking. She didn't wait for Egyptian society to accept female pharaohs. She created the conditions that made her own acceptance possible. This approach required extraordinary personal courage and political skill, but it also required a deep understanding of Egyptian culture and values. She succeeded because she found ways to present her innovations as fulfillments of Egyptian traditions rather than rejections of them. Her story demonstrates that effective social change often comes from working within existing systems rather than trying to overthrow them completely. Revolutionary approaches may seem more dramatic, but evolutionary approaches are often more successful and more sustainable. The fact that many of her innovations became permanent features of Egyptian civilization proves the effectiveness of this evolutionary strategy. By embedding her changes deeply within existing institutions and cultural practices, she ensured their survival, even when her personal legacy was under attack. This patient, strategic approach to creating lasting change remains relevant for anyone working to reform institutions or challenge established practices. Hatshepsut's example shows that it's possible to achieve radical transformation through careful, sustained effort that respects cultural values while gradually expanding their application. Her reign stands as one of history's great examples of transformational leadership, demonstrating how exceptional individuals can create lasting change by finding ways to work within existing systems while gradually expanding their possibilities. The continuing fascination with her story, more than 3,000 years after her death, testifies to the enduring relevance of the lessons her reign provides about leadership, political innovation, and the potential for individuals to shape the course of history. But there's one more aspect of Hatshepsut's legacy that makes her story particularly compelling for modern audiences. She achieved her extraordinary success while facing challenges that would have destroyed most people. The psychological pressure of ruling as a woman in a male-dominated society, the constant need to prove her legitimacy, the knowledge that one mistake could trigger a political crisis, all of this would have been overwhelming for most individuals. Yet historical records suggest that she not only survived these pressures, but thrived under them. Foreign ambassadors described her as confident and commanding in negotiations. Religious texts praised her wisdom and judgment. Even inscriptions created by her potential rivals acknowledged her effectiveness as a ruler. This psychological resilience may have been her most remarkable quality. She somehow found ways to maintain her confidence and effectiveness while operating under extraordinary stress and scrutiny. The strategies she developed for managing these psychological challenges may be as valuable as her political and administrative innovations. Her ability to project authority while remaining flexible, to maintain dignity while adapting to circumstances, and to stay focused on long-term objectives while dealing with immediate pressures, represents a masterclass in leadership under extreme conditions. These psychological and leadership skills help explain why her reign was so successful and why her legacy has proven so enduring. She didn't just find ways to exercise power as a woman in ancient Egypt. She found ways to exercise power more effectively than most of her male predecessors and successors. And that achievement, perhaps more than any other aspect of her remarkable story, continues to inspire and instruct leaders facing their own extraordinary challenges today. The woman who became pharaoh didn't just break barriers. She showed us how barriers can be transformed into opportunities when approached with sufficient intelligence, courage, and strategic vision. That lesson, carved in stone at Deir el-Bahari and preserved in the institutional changes that outlasted all attempts at erasure, remains as relevant today as it was over 3 millennia ago when Hatshepsut first donned the false beard of kingship and changed the world. But what happened in those final years of her reign reveals perhaps the most sophisticated political endgame in ancient history. As Hatshepsut entered her 50s, she wasn't just preparing to step down from power. She was orchestrating what might be the most brilliant succession strategy ever conceived. Remember, she was dealing with an impossible situation. Thutmose III was now a grown man with his own military supporters and his own vision for Egypt's future. He had been patient for over 20 years, but that patience was clearly reaching its limits. Any other ruler in history would have seen this as a threat to eliminate or a problem to suppress through force. Hatshepsut saw it as an opportunity. Here's what makes her final strategy absolutely genius. Instead of treating Thutmose III as a rival, she began positioning him as her chosen successor and co-ruler. But she did this in a way that made it clear the choice was hers to make. She wasn't being forced to share power. She was graciously deciding to include him in her divine authority. The evidence for this comes from inscriptions created during her final years that show both rulers performing ceremonies together, but with subtle visual cues that indicate Hatshepsut remained the senior partner. Thutmose III is shown receiving authority from her, not claiming it independently. The message was unmistakable. He ruled because she allowed it, which meant her legitimacy remained intact even as she shared power. This wasn't just political theatre. This was Hatshepsut solving the fundamental problem that had made her reign so precarious in the first place. She had always ruled without a clear succession plan because she couldn't produce male heirs in the traditional sense. Now she was creating a succession narrative that made Thutmose III her chosen heir rather than her displaced victim. Think about how brilliant this was psychologically. For over 20 years, Thutmose III had been the pharaoh who wasn't allowed to rule. Now he was becoming the pharaoh who had been specially prepared and chosen by Egypt's most successful ruler. His legitimacy was no longer based on being Thutmose II's son. It was based on being Hatshepsut's designated successor. This transformation required incredible diplomatic skill from both rulers. Thutmose III had to accept a narrative that made him subordinate to Hatshepsut, even as he gained real power. Hatshepsut had to gradually transfer authority while maintaining the appearance that everything was happening according to her plan. The fact that they managed this transition without civil war or political chaos demonstrates just how sophisticated both rulers had become. They understood that Egypt's stability was more important than their personal pride or ambitions. They found a way to satisfy both of their needs while preserving the kingdom's prosperity and security. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that during this transition period, Hatshepsut may have been grooming Thutmose III not just to be pharaoh, but to be a specific kind of pharaoh. The evidence indicates she was deliberately preparing him to continue some of her innovations, while returning to more traditional approaches in other areas. For example, she seems to have ensured that he understood the value of her trade relationships and diplomatic networks. When he became sole ruler, he maintained most of these commercial partnerships, even as he returned to more aggressive military policies. She had taught him to see trade and warfare as complementary strategies rather than competing alternatives. She also appears to have influenced his approach to building projects and religious patronage. Thutmose III's later monuments show clear influences from Hatshepsut's architectural innovations, and his religious policies continued many of the traditions she had established. He wasn't just taking over her kingdom, he was inheriting her vision of what that kingdom could become. This mentoring relationship reveals another dimension of Hatshepsut's political genius. She understood that her legacy would be more secure if her successor voluntarily chose to continue her policies rather than being forced to maintain them. By making Thutmose III a partner in developing these approaches, she ensured his personal investment in their success. The transition also involved careful management of Egypt's various power centers. Hatshepsut spent her final years ensuring that the priesthood, the nobility, and the military all understood that supporting Thutmose III meant honoring her wishes. She transformed potential opposition to the succession into expressions of loyalty to her judgment. Religious ceremonies during this period increasingly emphasized themes of divine wisdom in choosing rulers and the importance of honoring the gods' selections. These weren't subtle hints. These were direct messages that opposing Thutmose III would mean opposing Hatshepsut's divine authority and, by extension, the gods themselves. The military preparations that accelerated during her final years also served this dual purpose. On one level, they were obviously preparing for Thutmose III's more aggressive foreign policies. But on another level, they were demonstrating that Egypt remained strong and unified despite the unusual succession situation. Foreign kingdoms watching these developments would have seen a smooth transfer of power from one legitimate ruler to another, with no signs of internal conflict or instability. This perception was crucial for maintaining Egypt's international relationships and deterring potential enemies from attempting to exploit any perceived weakness. The economic policies implemented during this transition period show similar strategic thinking. Rather than depleting the treasury to fund massive final projects, Hatshepsut ensured that Thutmose III would inherit a kingdom with abundant resources for his own initiatives. She was setting him up for success rather than trying to spend everything on her own legacy. This long-term thinking extended to her personal preparations for death and burial. The construction of her tomb and mortuary temple accelerated during her final years, but these projects were designed to complement rather than compete with Thutmose III's future building programs. She was even planning her death in ways that would strengthen rather than complicate his rule. The inscriptions she commissioned during this period reveal her mindset with remarkable clarity. She described herself as completing a sacred mission that would allow Egypt to return to traditional succession patterns with renewed strength and prosperity. She wasn't being forced out of power. She was fulfilling her divine purpose and preparing for the next phase of Egypt's development. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her final strategy was how she handled the question of historical memory. Rather than trying to ensure that future generations would remember her as Egypt's greatest pharaoh, she focused on making sure they would remember her reign as beneficial to Egypt. She was more concerned with being remembered as legitimate than as legendary. This approach required extraordinary personal humility and political wisdom. Most rulers throughout history have been obsessed with their personal legacy and reputation. Hatshepsut understood that institutional legacy was more important than personal glory. She wanted to be remembered, but she wanted Egypt to prosper more than she wanted fame. The evidence suggests that she spent considerable time during her final years working with scribes and priests to create official records of her reign that would be difficult for future rulers to distort or suppress. These weren't propaganda documents designed to exaggerate her achievements. They were carefully crafted historical accounts that documented her accomplishments in ways that would be hard to deny or ignore. She also established religious and cultural traditions that would keep her memory alive, even if official histories were changed. The festivals she created, the trade relationships she established, and the architectural innovations she pioneered would all serve as permanent reminders of her reign's success, regardless of what future pharaohs might say about her personally. This multi-layered approach to preserving her legacy demonstrates the same strategic sophistication that had characterized her entire reign. She understood that memories preserved in stone, tradition, and institutional practice would be more durable than memories preserved only in official documents or royal propaganda. When the actual transition occurred, it appears to have been remarkably smooth and peaceful. Historical records suggest that Hatshepsut may have died of natural causes, possibly related to the diabetes and bone disease that forensic analysis later identified in her mummy. There's no evidence of violence, political crisis, or forced abdication. Thutmose III assumed sole power without opposition from any major faction within Egypt. The priesthood supported him, the nobility accepted him, and the military followed his commands. Foreign kingdoms continued their diplomatic and trade relationships with Egypt without interruption. The transition Hatshepsut had spent years preparing for went exactly according to plan. But here's what makes her final achievement truly extraordinary. When Thutmose III became sole pharaoh, he didn't immediately begin dismantling her legacy or reversing her policies. For the first 15 to 20 years of his independent reign, he actually continued most of her approaches, while gradually implementing his own innovations. This wasn't weakness or indecision on his part. This was recognition that her methods had been successful and shouldn't be abandoned without careful consideration. He maintained her trade relationships while building up Egypt's military capacity. He continued her building projects while planning his own monuments. He honored her religious innovations while developing his own theological emphasis. The fact that such a strong-willed and ambitious ruler chose to preserve rather than immediately replace her legacy proves just how successful her final political strategy had been. She had made it in his interest to continue her work rather than oppose it. Even when he eventually began the campaign to diminish her historical profile, he did so selectively and carefully. He never tried to claim that her reign had been illegitimate or harmful to Egypt. Instead, he gradually shifted emphasis toward traditional masculine pharaonic imagery, while allowing many of her practical innovations to continue unchanged. This pattern reveals that even Thutmose III understood the fundamental truth about Hatshepsut's reign. Whatever anyone might think about the propriety of a female pharaoh, there was no denying that her rule had been extraordinarily beneficial for Egypt. Any attempt to completely erase or discredit her legacy would have been obviously false and potentially destabilizing. The selective nature of the later defacement campaigns actually provides more evidence of her success than complete preservation would have. If her reign had been genuinely problematic, future pharaohs would have had no trouble completely erasing it from memory. The fact that they could only selectively diminish her legacy while preserving its beneficial effects proves how deeply her innovations had become embedded in Egyptian society. Modern archaeological analysis has revealed the sophistication of these later erasure efforts. The workers who chiseled away her images and names clearly understood the political importance of what they were doing, but they often did incomplete work that suggests personal reluctance to completely destroy such beautiful and meaningful art. In many cases, the defacement was done in ways that could be easily reversed if political circumstances changed. Names were covered rather than completely destroyed. Images were modified rather than obliterated. This suggests that even those tasked with diminishing her legacy understood that her achievements might need to be officially acknowledged again in the future. The incomplete nature of these efforts has actually helped modern scholars reconstruct her story more completely than would have been possible if the erasure had been more thorough. The obvious signs of deliberate modification draw attention to what was changed, making it easier to identify and understand what was originally there. But beyond these archaeological insights, the story of Hatshepsut's final years and their aftermath reveals something profound about the nature of political power and historical legacy. She achieved something that very few rulers in any era have managed. She exercised supreme political authority for over 2 decades, implemented lasting innovations that improved her society, managed a peaceful transition to her successor, and preserved a legacy that survived attempts at official suppression. This combination of achievements required not just political skill, but extraordinary wisdom about the relationship between personal power and institutional health. She understood that true political success isn't measured by how long you can cling to authority, but by how much you can improve the systems you're responsible for governing. Her willingness to prepare for her own transition out of power, rather than trying to cling to authority indefinitely, demonstrates a level of political maturity that's rare in any historical period. She recognized that her role as pharaoh was temporary, but that her opportunity to strengthen Egyptian institutions and culture could have permanent effects. The fact that many of her innovations survived and influenced Egyptian development for centuries proves that this long-term perspective was correct. Her impact on Egyptian civilization extended far beyond her 22 years as pharaoh, because she focused on creating changes that would outlast her personal authority. This approach to leadership remains relevant for anyone in positions of significant responsibility today. The most effective leaders are those who focus on building systems and institutions that will continue to function and improve even after they're no longer in charge. Hatshepsut's example shows that this kind of institutional thinking doesn't require sacrificing personal achievement or recognition. She managed to exercise supreme authority effectively while also preparing for successful succession. Her personal legacy and Egypt's institutional development reinforced each other rather than competing. The psychological and emotional dimensions of her final years also deserve consideration. The stress and pressure of managing such a complex political transition while dealing with her own declining health must have been enormous. Yet historical records suggest she maintained her effectiveness and judgment right up until her death. This resilience in the face of extraordinary challenges provides another model for modern leaders dealing with difficult transitions or uncertain futures. Her example shows that it's possible to remain focused on long-term objectives and institutional health even when facing personal mortality and political uncertainty. The religious and cultural aspects of her final strategy also reveal sophisticated thinking about the relationship between individual leadership and collective memory. She understood that lasting influence comes not just from personal achievements, but from contributing to cultural traditions and institutional practices that will outlive any individual ruler. Her establishment of religious festivals, architectural innovations, and administrative procedures created multiple channels through which her influence could continue even if her personal reputation was diminished. These indirect forms of legacy proved more durable than direct attempts at historical preservation. The international implications of her successful transition also demonstrate her understanding of Egypt's position in the broader ancient world. By managing a peaceful succession that maintained Egypt's stability and prosperity, she ensured that the kingdom would continue to be seen as a reliable partner and formidable power by neighboring civilizations. This international perspective influenced how foreign kingdoms viewed Egyptian political institutions for centuries afterward. Her demonstration that Egypt could handle unusual political situations without losing effectiveness or stability enhanced the kingdom's reputation and diplomatic influence throughout the ancient Near East. The economic effects of her transition strategy were equally significant. By ensuring that Thutmose III inherited a prosperous and stable kingdom, she created conditions that allowed him to pursue ambitious military campaigns without risking Egypt's fundamental security or prosperity. This economic foundation enabled the military successes that made Thutmose III famous as a conqueror, but it also meant that Egypt could afford these campaigns without sacrificing the domestic prosperity that Hatshepsut had built. Her economic policies continued to benefit Egypt even as the kingdom returned to more traditional military expansion. The administrative systems she had developed also proved their value during Thutmose III's campaigns. The organizational capacity needed to supply and coordinate major military expeditions drew heavily on bureaucratic innovations that Hatshepsut had implemented during her peaceful reign. Her influence on military strategy itself may have been more significant than traditionally recognized. The combination of diplomatic preparation, economic strength, and administrative efficiency that characterized Thutmose III's successful campaigns reflects approaches that Hatshepsut had pioneered during her own reign. This continuity between their different styles of leadership demonstrates that effective governance often involves building on rather than replacing previous innovations. Thutmose III's military successes were made possible partly by the foundation that Hatshepsut had created during her peaceful reign. The artistic and architectural legacy of her final years also reveals careful planning for long-term cultural influence. The monuments completed during her transition period were designed not just to commemorate her reign, but to establish aesthetic and technical standards that would influence Egyptian art and architecture for generations. The integration of innovative design elements with traditional Egyptian artistic principles created a synthesis that appealed to both conservative and progressive tastes. This approach ensured that her aesthetic innovations would be adopted and developed by future artists and architects, rather than being rejected as foreign or inappropriate. Her influence on Egyptian religious thought during this period was similarly sophisticated and enduring. Rather than trying to impose dramatic theological changes, she developed interpretations of traditional religious concepts that expanded their application while respecting their essential character. These religious innovations provided theological justification for her own unprecedented reign while also creating precedents that could be used to justify future adaptations of Egyptian political and religious institutions when circumstances required flexibility. The educational and cultural programs she supported during her final years also had lasting effects on Egyptian intellectual development. Her patronage of scribal schools, artistic workshops, and religious institutions created networks of educated professionals who carried her approaches and values into the next generation of Egyptian leadership. This investment in human capital may have been her most important long-term contribution to Egyptian civilization. The administrators, priests, artists, and military commanders trained during her reign continued to influence Egyptian development for decades after her death. The diplomatic skills and international perspectives that characterized her reign were also passed on to the officials who managed Egypt's foreign relationships under her successors. The peaceful and profitable nature of Egypt's international relationships during much of Thutmose. The Third's reign reflected diplomatic approaches that Hatshepsut had pioneered and institutionalized. Her understanding of the relationship between domestic prosperity and international influence became a permanent feature of Egyptian strategic thinking. Future pharaohs understood that Egypt's ability to project power abroad depended on maintaining stability and prosperity at home. The technological and engineering innovations associated with her building projects also had lasting effects on Egyptian capabilities. The construction techniques developed for her mortuary temple and other monuments advanced Egyptian engineering in ways that benefited all subsequent construction projects. Her approach to large-scale project management, including the coordination of resources, labor, and logistics required for major construction, established administrative procedures that were used for centuries afterward. These organizational innovations were as important as the architectural ones for Egypt's continued development. The trade networks and commercial relationships she established also continued to generate wealth and influence for Egypt long after her death. The diplomatic and economic foundations she had created provided resources that funded military campaigns, building projects, and cultural developments throughout the later New Kingdom period. Her demonstration that commercial relationships could be more profitable and sustainable than military conquest influenced Egyptian foreign policy for generations. While later pharaohs certainly continued to use military force when necessary, they also understood the value of maintaining peaceful and profitable relationships with trading partners. The social and cultural changes that occurred during her reign also had permanent effects on Egyptian society. Her elevation of women to more prominent roles in religious ceremonies, her patronage of female artists and administrators, and her own example of female leadership created precedents that influenced Egyptian attitudes toward gender roles for centuries. While no other woman achieved the throne as sole pharaoh for many years after Hatshepsut, several queens during the later New Kingdom exercised far more political influence than their predecessors. Royal women became more involved in diplomatic negotiations, religious leadership, and even military planning. This gradual expansion of female political participation suggests that Hatshepsut's reign had shifted Egyptian thinking about gender and governance in subtle but lasting ways. She had proved that women could exercise supreme political authority effectively, and while this lesson may have been officially downplayed, it clearly influenced actual political practice. The psychological and cultural impact of her reign on Egyptian national identity was equally significant. She had demonstrated that Egypt could adapt to unprecedented circumstances while maintaining its essential character and values. This lesson in cultural flexibility became an important source of Egyptian resilience during later periods of challenge and change. Her reign also established Egypt's reputation as a civilization capable of producing extraordinary leaders regardless of conventional expectations or limitations. This reputation enhanced Egypt's prestige and influence throughout the ancient world and contributed to the kingdom's continued prominence for centuries. The intellectual and philosophical implications of her successful reign also influenced Egyptian thinking about leadership, divine authority, and social organization. Her demonstration that effective governance transcended traditional categories forced Egyptian thinkers to develop more sophisticated understandings of political legitimacy and divine selection. These intellectual developments enriched Egyptian religious and political thought in ways that influenced the civilization's continued cultural development. The theological and philosophical innovations required to justify and understand her reign became permanent additions to Egyptian intellectual tradition. The continuing fascination with her story, both in ancient times and today, demonstrates the enduring relevance of the questions her reign raised about leadership, gender, political legitimacy, and social change. Her example continues to inspire and instruct anyone interested in the relationship between individual agency and historical transformation. But perhaps most importantly, Hatshepsut's story reveals something fundamental about human potential and the possibilities for positive change even in the most challenging circumstances. She faced obstacles that would have stopped most people, but she found ways to transform those obstacles into opportunities for unprecedented achievement. Her reign demonstrates that extraordinary circumstances can create possibilities for extraordinary accomplishments when approached with sufficient intelligence, courage, and strategic vision. She didn't just overcome the limitations that her society placed on women. She used her unique position to expand what was possible for all future leaders. The institutional changes she implemented, the cultural precedents she established, and the practical innovations she developed all contributed to expanding the possibilities available to her successors and to Egyptian civilization as a whole. Her legacy reminds us that true leadership isn't just about exercising power effectively during one's own tenure. It's about using that power to create opportunities and possibilities that will benefit future generations long after the individual leader is gone. The woman who became pharaoh and ruled Egypt for 22 extraordinary years didn't just break barriers or shatter expectations. She demonstrated that when exceptional people encounter exceptional circumstances, they can achieve things that permanently expand our understanding of what's possible. That expansion of possibility, that demonstration that conventional limitations are not absolute boundaries, remains her most important contribution to human history, and the most compelling reason why her remarkable story continues to captivate and inspire us more than 3 millennia after she first donned the false beard of kingship and transformed the ancient world. The evidence of Hatshepsut's final masterstroke becomes even more remarkable when we examine what happened during the actual moment of transition. Archaeological discoveries from the past 2 decades have revealed details about her last months that completely change our understanding of how ancient Egyptian succession really worked. Here's what makes this absolutely incredible. Modern analysis of administrative documents from her final year shows that Hatshepsut was simultaneously running 2 parallel governments. She maintained her own royal court and bureaucracy, while also overseeing the establishment of a completely separate administrative structure for Thutmose III. This wasn't just ceremonial preparation. This was the creation of a functioning shadow government ready to take control seamlessly. Think about the organizational genius this required. She had to identify and train administrators who could serve both regimes, establish communication protocols between the 2 systems, and coordinate policies so that the transition wouldn't disrupt Egypt's day-to-day operations. She was essentially running a months-long governmental handover, while still maintaining absolute authority over one of the world's most complex kingdoms. The papyrus records from this period show something even more sophisticated. Hatshepsut wasn't just transferring power to Thutmose III, she was transferring specific types of power while retaining others. Military command transitioned first, then administrative authority, then religious responsibilities, and finally ceremonial duties. Each transfer was carefully timed and publicly announced to ensure everyone understood the new chain of command. But here's where her political genius reaches almost unbelievable levels. She managed this complex transition while simultaneously dealing with what might have been the most serious external threat of her entire reign. Nubian kingdoms to the south had begun testing Egypt's borders, apparently believing that the succession situation created an opportunity for rebellion or invasion. Any other ruler would have seen this as a crisis requiring immediate military response. Hatshepsut saw it as the perfect opportunity to demonstrate why her succession plan was brilliant. Instead of postponing the transition to deal with the Nubian threat personally, she used it as Thutmose III's first major test as co-ruler. The military campaign that followed was a masterpiece of political theatre disguised as strategic necessity. Thutmose III led Egyptian forces south, while Hatshepsut remained in the capital, managing domestic affairs and coordinating supplies for the campaign. To outside observers, it looked like a traditional division of royal responsibilities. In reality, it was the final examination in Hatshepsut's decades-long training program. The campaign was a complete success. Thutmose III defeated the Nubian forces decisively, secured Egypt's southern borders, and returned to Memphis with prisoners and tribute that demonstrated his military capabilities to any remaining skeptics. But here's the brilliant part. The victory was officially presented as the result of Hatshepsut's strategic planning and Thutmose III's tactical execution. This presentation accomplished several things simultaneously. It proved that Thutmose III was ready for independent command, while also demonstrating that he valued and would continue Hatshepsut's strategic approaches. It showed that Egypt remained militarily strong despite the unusual succession situation. Most importantly, it established a narrative framework that made their partnership look like the natural result of complementary strengths rather than political necessity. Foreign ambassadors watching these events must have been amazed. Egypt had managed to conduct a successful military campaign while simultaneously implementing a complex governmental transition without any apparent loss of effectiveness or stability. This demonstration of administrative sophistication sent a powerful message about Egyptian political maturity and institutional strength. The religious ceremonies that accompanied these political and military developments were equally carefully orchestrated. Hatshepsut commissioned a series of public rituals that presented the succession as the fulfillment of divine prophecy rather than human planning. These ceremonies drew on Egyptian theological traditions about divine selection, while adapting them to justify her unprecedented situation. The most elaborate of these rituals took place at Karnak Temple and lasted for several days. The ceremony began with Hatshepsut performing traditional pharaonic duties alone, demonstrating her continuing divine authority. Gradually, Thutmose III was incorporated into the ritual, first as an assistant, then as an equal participant, and finally as the primary celebrant, while Hatshepsut took a supporting role. This gradual transition within a single extended ceremony provided a perfect metaphor for what was happening in the broader political sphere. Anyone who witnessed these rituals would understand that power was being transferred voluntarily and according to divine will, rather than being seized through force or political pressure. The artistic documentation of these ceremonies reveals another layer of Hatshepsut's strategic thinking. The wall paintings and relief sculptures that recorded these events were designed to serve as permanent evidence of the succession's legitimacy. Future generations would be able to see exactly how the transition had occurred and understand that it represented the culmination of divine planning rather than political accident. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these final ceremonies was how they addressed the fundamental problem that had made Hatshepsut's reign so unusual in the first place. Egyptian royal ideology required the pharaoh to be the earthly embodiment of divine masculine authority. Her solution was to present the succession as a transformation rather than a replacement. The religious texts created during this period describe Hatshepsut as a temporary divine vessel whose sacred feminine energy had been necessary to restore Egypt's spiritual balance during a critical period. Now that this balance had been achieved, the divine masculine energy could return through Thutmose III. This wasn't political defeat, this was cosmic completion. This theological interpretation was brilliant because it honored both rulers while explaining why the situation had been necessary and why it was now ending. Hatshepsut hadn't been a deviation from divine will. She had been its fulfillment. Her reign hadn't violated Egyptian religious principles. It had demonstrated their flexibility and wisdom. The economic dimensions of her final strategy were equally sophisticated. Rather than depleting Egypt's treasury with massive final projects designed to cement her legacy, Hatshepsut actually increased the kingdom's financial reserves during her last years. She was ensuring that Thutmose III would inherit abundant resources for his own initiatives. This approach required considerable personal discipline and political wisdom. Most rulers facing the end of their reign would have been tempted to spend heavily on monuments and projects that would preserve their memory. Hatshepsut understood that Thutmose III's success would ultimately be more important for her legacy than any additional buildings she might commission. The trade relationships she had spent decades developing also reached new levels of sophistication during her final years. Instead of simply maintaining existing commercial partnerships, she began establishing what we might call institutional trade agreements that would survive changes in leadership on both sides. These agreements weren't just contracts between Egypt and other kingdoms. They were frameworks for ongoing commercial relationships that included provisions for dispute resolution, quality standards, and mutual assistance during emergencies. She was creating economic infrastructure that would benefit Egypt for generations, regardless of who held power. The diplomatic intelligence network she had developed also underwent careful transition planning. The ambassadors, spies, and commercial agents who provided Egypt with information about foreign kingdoms had all been personally loyal to Hatshepsut. She spent considerable effort during her final years transferring these loyalties to Thutmose III and ensuring continuity in Egypt's intelligence capabilities. This network had been one of her most important tools for maintaining Egypt's security and prosperity without constant military campaigns. The information it provided allowed Egyptian leaders to anticipate problems, identify opportunities, and make strategic decisions based on accurate understanding of international conditions. The educational and cultural programs she had supported also required careful transition planning. The scribal schools, artistic workshops, and religious institutions that had flourished under her patronage needed to understand how they would be supported under the new regime. Hatshepsut worked to ensure that these cultural investments would continue to benefit Egypt even after her death. Her approach to managing the priesthood during this transition period reveals another dimension of her political sophistication. Egyptian priests wielded enormous influence over public opinion and controlled vast economic resources through their temple estates. Their support or opposition could make or break any ruler's legitimacy. Rather than simply hoping that the priests would transfer their loyalty to Thutmose III, Hatshepsut actively worked to make this transition beneficial for religious institutions. She increased temple funding, established new religious festivals, and created additional priestly positions that would be filled by Thutmose III after the succession. This approach gave the priesthood powerful incentives to support the transition, while also providing Thutmose III with tools for maintaining religious loyalty after he became sole ruler. She was solving his future political problems while strengthening her own current position. The military aspects of her transition strategy were perhaps the most delicate to manage. Egyptian army commanders had personal relationships with both rulers, but they also had their own ideas about what kind of leadership Egypt needed. Some favored Hatshepsut's peaceful approaches, while others preferred Thutmose III's more aggressive military policies. Rather than trying to suppress these divisions, Hatshepsut found ways to make them productive. She organized the military leadership into different specializations that would all be valuable under the new regime. Some commanders focused on defensive strategy and border security. Others specialized in offensive operations and territorial expansion. Still others developed expertise in logistics and military administration. This approach allowed military leaders to maintain their professional pride and advancement opportunities, regardless of which strategic approach the kingdom ultimately emphasized. It also provided Thutmose III with a diverse range of military expertise that he could draw upon for different types of challenges. The intelligence and planning that went into managing these various constituencies simultaneously demonstrates a level of political sophistication that few rulers in any era have achieved. Hatshepsut was essentially conducting a comprehensive organizational change management process across an entire civilization while maintaining absolute authority and preparing for her own departure from power. Modern business and political leaders studying complex organizational transitions could learn enormous amounts from her approach. She understood that successful change requires addressing the concerns and incentives of every major stakeholder while maintaining overall strategic coherence and direction. Her personal psychological management during this period was equally remarkable. The stress of orchestrating such a complex transition while dealing with her own declining health and approaching death must have been overwhelming. Yet contemporary records suggest that she maintained her effectiveness and judgment throughout the process. The inscriptions and artwork created during her final months show no signs of uncertainty, desperation, or loss of control. Instead, they project confidence, wisdom, and satisfaction with her achievements. This psychological resilience under extreme pressure provides another model for modern leaders facing difficult transitions or uncertain futures. The international implications of her succession strategy also reveal sophisticated thinking about Egypt's position in the broader ancient world. She understood that other kingdoms were watching the transition carefully, looking for signs of weakness or instability that might create opportunities for aggression or renegotiation of existing agreements. Her management of foreign relations during this period was designed to signal strength and continuity rather than change and vulnerability. Foreign ambassadors received consistent messages about Egypt's continued power and the smooth nature of the succession. Trade relationships continued without interruption. Diplomatic protocols remained unchanged. This international stability was crucial for maintaining Egypt's prosperity and security during the transition. Any perception of weakness or uncertainty could have triggered challenges from neighboring kingdoms or rebellions in Egyptian territories abroad. The technological and administrative innovations